I'm the Gangster Nerd, and I love comic books, in case you ain't already figured that out. Why do I love comic books? Because they're damn good stories wrote by damn good authors. Sometimes they don't get the accolades other literary authors might, but their works just talk for themselves. I'm Walt, the most Gangster Nerd on YouTube, and these are the best comic book writers ever.
Garth Ennis. When it comes to gritty and violent material, you're hard-pressed to find someone better than Garth Ennis. Best known for his takes on The Punisher, Judge Dredd, Hellblazer, Hitman, and most famously The Preacher, Ennis is probably the greatest anti-hero writer of all time. You may have even heard of a few of his best storylines: Punisher Max, Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe, Judge Dredd's Judgment Day. This man can construct a story so unbelievably hardcore, pack it to its gills with violence, then execute it so perfectly you'll find yourself wishing it wasn't over. Over the years, he's won 2 Eisner Awards for Best Writer and Best Single Issue, as well as an Eagle Award for his work on Preacher. In recent years, he's been writing for the indies, doing awesome work for both Dynamite and Avatar, as well as seeing his biggest hit, Preacher, go on to become a TV series. Chris Claremont. Have you ever heard of the X-Men? Of course you have. You know why you've heard of the X-Men? Chris Claremont. Becoming the writer for Uncanny X-Men in 1975 and staying on until 1991, if you haven't heard of the Dark Phoenix Saga, Days of Future Past, or God Loves, Man Kills, which are some of the greatest stories of all time, maybe you've heard of some of his character creations, such as Gambit, Mr. Sinister, Sabretooth, Rogue, Emma Frost, and Rachel Summers. Being one of the most inventive writers in comic book history, it's no surprise that he actually wrote the greatest-selling single issue of all time, X-Men Volume 2, Number 1. And it's his writing genius that made the X-Men a stand-in for all minorities. Since ending his legacy run on X-Men in 1995, he has gone on to do equally awesome things, writing Predator vs. Aliens, and donating his archive of major works to Columbia University. Awesome. Jonathan Hickman. Undoubtedly one of the greatest of all time, Jonathan Hickman is both a giant at Marvel as well as a titan of indie comics. While being a major writer at Marvel, writing the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the New Avengers, Ultimate Thor, the Ultimates, Avengers vs. X-Men, Infinity, Secret Wars, which has got to be the greatest event story ever, he actually got his first major break at Image, writing and illustrating the Nightly News, as well as Pax Romana, both being provocative and sensational, dealing with and commenting on societal topics such as religion and media. And, while still at Marvel, he would write The Red Wing for Image, an interesting story that Comic Book Resources correctly describes as Top Gun meets Starship Troopers meets Time Cop. But if you really want to know why the man is one of the best, simply look up his run on God is Dead from 2013, a thinly veiled critique of world religion that demonstrates just how far ahead this man really was and still is. Brian Michael Bendis. Brian Michael Bendis came to Image Comics in 1997, where he quickly gained the interest of founder Todd McFarlane. Bendis would work on various titles at Image, such as Hellspawn and Fortune and Glory. However, in 2000, Brian would put the world on notice with Powers, a superhero and police comic, which would go on to win Eisner, Harvey, and Eagle Awards. From there, he would move on to Marvel to write Ultimate Spider-Man, the beginning of the iconic Ultimate Universe. Along with pitching the original ideas for most of the Ultimate Universe characters, not afraid to push boundaries, Bendis would in time become responsible for the invention of some of the most popular and most important characters, as well as concepts and undertones in modern comics. It's no surprise he's actually considered the best comic writer of all time. Everything he's touched at Marvel has turned to gold. Well, okay, except that. Recently, Bendis mixed things up again, moving from Marvel to DC and beginning work on Superman. Awesome. Grant Morrison. Morrison would start out writing comics while also playing rhythm guitar in his rock band, The Mixers. That's pretty awesome to begin with when you think about it. He would write for various indie titles in the UK during the 80s, but would find a hit in Zenith, In 1987, a superhero comic that explored and remarked on cultural and political differences of the time. DC would offer him a job after this, putting him alongside Alan Moore and others, dubbed as the British invasion of American comics. He would find initial success with Animal Man and Doom Patrol, but in 1989 he would write Arkham Asylum, a serious house on Serious Earth, though many know it better today as just Batman Arkham Asylum. Do I need to tell you how important this story is to the Batman mythos? The 90s would see him write Batman, Legends of the Dark Knight, and Justice League of America revamp, JLA, both being bestsellers, while also writing other well-known titles such as Kid Eternity, Dan Dare, Judge Dredd, Sebastian O, The Mystery Play, and The Invisibles. The 2000s would only see Morrison do better, writing the graphic novel JLA Earth 2 before moving on to Marvel Comics in 2001 and taking on the X-Men title New X-Men, taking it straight to #1. He would go back to DC in 2004 and write JLA Classified, as well as Seven Soldiers. He would write 2005's All-Star Superman, which has more awards than you may believe. In 2006, he would write for Batman and would reintroduce Damian Wayne. 2007, he wrote Final Crisis and 2010's Batman Incorporated. He also did DC Multiversity in 2014. He was also voted the second most important comic book writer of all time, according to Comic Book Resources, and in 2012 was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire for his services to film and literature. Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby is probably best remembered as one of, if not the most important illustrator of all time. Starting off with a bang, he and partner Joe Simon would create Captain America in 1940 for Marvel precursor Timely Comics, though they would leave for National Comic Publications, the precursor to DC. 1943 would see Jack get drafted and go fight in World War II. He would return a decorated badass in 1945 and would go straight back to work in the comic industry, working with Joe Simon again at Harvey Comics. They would find repeated success, even founding their own company, Mainline Comics, in 1954, though the company would fold in 1955, but the two would part friends. Jack would freelance stories until coming back to Marvel exclusively in 1958. 1961, he and Stan Lee would blow up with the Fantastic Four, and after that came the explosion of Marvel characters such as Thor, Hulk, and the X-Men. What's disappointing is the fact that he never received credit for his contributions, and in 1971 he would make the jump to DC Comics, creating his Fourth World, which included the New Gods, Mr. Miracle, and the Forever People. But in 1976 he would return to Marvel, writing and drawing Captain America as well as Black Panther, also creating the Eternals, the Celestials, Devil Dinosaur, and would work one final time with Stan Lee on Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience in 1978. Before his passing in 1994, Jack would work in both film and animation, and even do occasional work for DC Comics. He would own the Kirbyverse over at Topps Comics, and the final comic he would work on, The Phantom Force, which would be published by Image. Truly one of the greatest of all time. Frank Miller. Frank Miller started as an artist, but when put on Daredevil in 1979, he began to shine. By 1981, he had taken over the responsibilities as writer, and Daredevil had caught fire. Miller would continue to define the series, inventing many iconic facets of the series, such as Stick, Daredevil Sensei, and the enemy ninja clan, The Hand. In 1982, he would prove that his darker and harder stories were ideal, when in Daredevil 181, Bullseye would assassinate Elektra. This is iconic. Soon after, he would work on Amazing Spider-Man annuals for 1980 and 1981, and begin working with Chris Claremont on the Wolverine miniseries that would expand and further evolve the character. After this, he would go on to work on one of the most iconic and influential Batman stories ever, The Dark Knight Returns, an industry changer showing that more adult-oriented stories were the way of the future, not to mention the fact that this story alone may have single-handedly saved Batman, who at the time was much less popular and was in danger of cancellation. Miller would continue to write for both titles for a while, Later, he would write the now epic Elektra Lives Again. The 90s would see Miller continue with Hard Boiled, Give Me Liberty, RoboCop, RoboCop vs. Terminator. He would work on the Spawn Batman crossover, but most importantly, Sin City, his defining work for the decade, which would go on to become a feature film. The 2000s would see him working on The Dark Knight Strikes Again and All-Star Batman and Robin. Though he has had some legal issues and made some controversial comments in years past, Frank Miller was inducted into the Eisner Award Hall of Fame. Awesome. And the greatest of all time, Alan Moore. Alan Moore is recognized by most of his peers as the greatest graphic novel writer of all time. He actually started out in 1978 writing for British fan magazines before blowing up as a comic strip writer for British magazine 2000 AD. This would catch the eyes of DC, who would hire him in 1983, first putting him to work on the Saga of the Swamp Thing. He would have a new take on the character which involved environmental issues mixed with horror, completely reinvigorating this character. Using that, Moore would also revive some of DC's forgotten mystical characters like Deadman, Phantom Stranger, the Spectre, and even introduced John Constantine the Hellblazer. This was the beginning of DC's Vertigo line, and it all radiates from Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. He would continue his success with two of the great Superman stories, For the Man Who Has Everything in 1985, and Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow in '86, the final pre-crisis Superman story. '86 would also see Moore write The Watchmen, a Cold War mystery superhero deconstruction that is widely considered as the greatest graphic novel of all time, simply because, well, it is. Also, in 1986, alongside the others, he wrote the Green Lantern Corps Annual No. 2, which serves as the inspiration for Blackest Night, wrote in 2009, some 20 plus years later. He would continue his unbeatable streak with The Killing Joke, an instant Batman classic, but it was around this time that mounting problems of creators' rights caused Moore to leave DC in 1989. And who could blame him? They were screwing him. After this, he would move away from fantasies and superheroes towards realism, politics, and other controversial issues. Moore would write such immortal indie classics as Arg, which challenged the British government's Clause 28 law at the time, as well as Brought to the Light, which dealt with the CIA's involvement in drugs and arms smuggling. After this, Moore would come to Image Comics, first working on Spawn and his own series 1963, but then moving on to Wildcats, then Supreme, which both became critical and commercial successes. Not long after this, politics at Image would force Moore to move on again to America's Best Comics, where he stayed until 2008, and then returning to the independent scene in 2009, where he has happily stayed ever since. And that's the list. Now, we both know I'm right, but if you feel you need to tell me something else, let me know in the comments. I'm Walt, the most gangster nerd on YouTube, and I'll be seeing you soon enough.